If you're anything like me, e-scouting is something that does not come naturally to you. I have friends that can look at the map for a little bit, and that's oftentimes all they need to put themselves into the action. Over the years, I've often been overly dependent on boots on the ground scouting. Not only has this made me less efficient and cost me a ton of time, but this deficiency has led me to eat tag soup on more trips than I care to admit. The silver lining though is that e-scouting is a skill, and just like any other skill, it can be learned and developed. That's why I'm making this video. Hopefully by the end, you'll be able to look at a map and have a much better idea of where you need to hunt. We'll walk through what the goal of e-scouting is, what tools you can use, how to identify a good area, as well as some specific examples to illustrate all of those. Before we jump in, if you like content like this that's designed to help you become a better hunter, make sure to smash that like button. My goal when e-scouting is to validate whether an area is worth scouting in person or hunting if I'm on a travel hunt. I'm also trying to prioritize spots within that area to maximize my efforts. Deer hunting boils down to being in the right place at the right time, and with effective e-scouting, you can spend more time in higher odds locations by accurately predicting where deer are and how they'll move through a property. Once you learn this skill, you can go anywhere in the country and have a great starting point before you even step out of the truck. Similar to in-person, boots on the ground scouting, my objective is to identify food sources, bedding areas, travel patterns, and where other hunters may be accessing. On a broader scale, my goal of e-scouting might be to take 100,000 acres, narrow it down to 200 acres where I'll focus all my time and energy. With all that to lay the groundwork, let's jump in and look at some of the tools you can use to accomplish this, as well as some of the helpful features in those tools. The tool that I use the most, e-scouting and in the field, is the onX Hunt app. Whether I'm scouting public or private land, the onX Hunt app is a super valuable tool that's packed full of features that allow me to be more efficient. You can see 3D hunting maps, view boundary lines, track your route, mark custom waypoints, measure distances and food plot sizes, and tons of other things that I'll save for another video. Really quickly though, if you're somebody that struggles to read topo maps, onX has an awesome feature that allows you to exaggerate the 3D view so you can really get a good idea of what the terrain's like in an area. The other tool that I'll use sometimes is Google Earth. Sometimes the imaging on Google Earth is hard to beat, so I'll cross-reference my e-scouting efforts from onX to Google Earth if I think I need a closer view of an area. Now the strategy for e-scouting is going to differ whether we're talking public or private land. If it's private land, the location and the boundaries are already identified, so it's just a matter of figuring it out. On public land, maybe I'm planning an out-of-state hunt, or maybe I just want to cast a wider net in the area that I live, but in either case, generally there's going to be much more land to choose from. Some things that I consider when choosing public lands to hunt are proximity to major cities, what time of season I plan to hunt, lodging options, terrain types, the amount of public available, and distance from home. But let's assume that I've already identified a state, what time of the season I'm planning to go, what type of terrain that I'm interested. And just for the sake of the example, let's say that a buddy invited me to stay at his house for the duration of the hunt. What's next? At this point, I'm gonna start as close to my home base as possible and work outwards. If I can find a good place close to my home base, that's a home run because I can spend more time in the field and less time driving. My process usually starts as a wide funnel and gets more refined as I go. So I'll start by just surfing around the map, looking at the chunks of public in that area. Initially, I'm just looking for properties that on a quick glance have food, cover, water, and some type of diversity, all the things that deer need to survive, and I'll drop pins on every property that seems to check those boxes. Once I've identified a few pieces of public, there's a list of things that I'm evaluating to prioritize which of those pieces I plan to spend the most time on, and then where within that piece I intend to focus on. My overall goal is to figure out where deer are likely to be, where other hunters are not likely to be, and then how I can get within bow range of a buck. So to jump in the order of operations, the first thing that I'm looking for when evaluating a specific piece is a primary food source. Sometimes this is on the public piece itself, and other times it's on the adjacent private land. I specifically seek out these types of properties though because it makes everything else a lot easier. It allows me to better predict the travel direction of the deer and just gives me more confidence in general that there's likely good deer numbers in that area. The only downfall is with obvious food sources, typically it comes with more hunter pressure, which we'll talk about in a minute. Some examples of primary food sources may look like ag fields, apple orchards, clear cuts, oak flats, and food plots. Also keep in mind that this is just a starting point. Just because there's a cornfield on the public land doesn't mean that I'm going to be hunting on the edge of it. One last note on food is that in some regions of the country, ag fields and other obvious food sources just rarely exist. That doesn't mean that there's no deer or no big bucks in that area though. For areas like that, I'll give some additional context around food when we get into some other points. Now the next thing I'm trying to figure out is where other hunters are likely to be. Pressure is the one thing that can make or break your hunt. You can find the best place in the world, but if other hunters are blowing up that area prior to your arrival, you're not going to see any deer. So I'll zoom in and look at all the parking areas, pull-offs, and access trails. Most hunters are going to set up within a couple hundred yards of these areas. So I'll cross off the most obvious, easy to access places on the map. There is some nuance in this because if you're in a remote area, far from any major cities where pressure is likely to be pretty low, some of these more obvious spots are probably still worth checking out. Also, overlooked spots close to roads or parking areas can be dynamite places to hunt. However, avoiding the areas where the highest concentration of human activity is likely to be is just a safe bet to reduce the amount of pressure that your target area is likely to receive. What you'll find though is some properties are just super accessible and there's nowhere you can get that's more than a couple hundred yards off of the beaten path. I usually eliminate these areas from my consideration and focus instead on trying to find areas where you can go deep and potentially go further than other hunters, or find areas that are tougher to access. Water is generally a great way to separate yourself from other hunters. Most other hunters are not going to carry in a pair of chest waders or haul in a kayak, and oftentimes even a single creek with water deep enough to flood your knee-high boots is enough to eliminate the majority of other hunters. There's plenty of hardcore guys out there though, but when e-scouting, all we can do is play the odds. Once I've identified some areas that have food in the general area, and I think I can get away from other hunters, the next thing that I'm looking for is diversity. Diversity means several habitat types coming together. And what diversity creates is edge, and as you've heard a million times, deer are creatures of edge. I don't want a monoculture of habitat regardless of what it is, but going back to one of the points that we discussed earlier, multiple converging habitat types typically mean several types of cover and browse for the deer as well, which not only can clue you into less obvious food sources, but also potential bedding areas. Finding diversity on the map can be as simple as looking for lots of different shades of colors and textures in one area. It can be cattails meeting areas of high ground with stands of oaks, pockets of cedars in a CRP field, or any other type of combination of habitat types. You can find areas that have food, minimal human intrusion, and lots of diversity. Then it just comes down to figuring out where the deer are likely to bed and how you can set up on them. This leads us to the next step. The first three things I'm looking for are really just to check off boxes, but once I've identified a property that meets that criteria, then it's really time to start investigating and putting together puzzle pieces. Determining where deer, and more specifically mature bucks, bed takes some knowledge and some practice. It varies based on the habitat type and the time of the season. Depending on what type of terrain we're talking about, that's going to dictate what I'm actually looking for. In swampy, marshy areas, e-scouting can be super effective. Typically, any high spot in the marsh is going to have bedding on it. What this typically looks like is a tree or an island out in the marsh. Once you find some of these, you can usually zoom in and see the deer trails from the satellite image. Remember, bucks are always going to bed in a way that allows them to use their senses to their advantage. This could be sight, sound, smell, or a combination of all three. In marsh swamp country, I find that most of these beds are set up so they'll be able to hear any approaching danger. Sight is generally very limited for the deer. I've also found that in certain cases the beds are less wind dependent, meaning they will bed there regardless of the wind direction, although the best beds, and the beds that I would assume are getting used by mature bucks, are set up to smell any threats coming from the mainland. Another good place to assume bedding is any high point or any timbered area that juts out into the marsh. These can be great places to hunt in the early season when bucks may be looking to hit the first oak tree on dry land before heading out to the ag fields under the cover of darkness. I'll drop pins on all of the likely bedding areas on the onX Hunt app. In a farmland setting, bucks typically will bed in a way that allows them to use all of their senses to their advantage. You'll usually find them on edges and transitions on the downwind side of cover where they can visually see any danger approaching while smelling anything coming from the cover behind them. Often they will bed in a way that allows them to monitor the most commonly used human access points. Other areas that bucks will bed are on the edges of ponds, in a brushy fence row, in a drainage ditch, or even in the ag field themselves if the crops are tall enough. Another good place to mark, just like in marsh country, is a timbered area that juts out into the ag field. Bucks will often bed on the edge of these points with the wind blowing over their backs so they can smell anything coming from the woods, and then they're able to look out into the open area and see what's in front of them. Again, I mark all of the suspected bedding and then I move on to the next step, which we'll get to in a minute. If I'm targeting a river bottom area, The oxbows of the river are the most obvious places on the map that you can assume bucks are bedding. An oxbow is simply just a U-shaped turn in the river. Bucks will bed in these oxbows with the wind blowing from the mainland out over the river. This allows them to smell anything coming from land, and they'll often be able to look out and see anything approaching from the water side. The other area that I notice a lot of bucks bedding is on the little islands in the middle of the river. Since pressure is one of the main factors we're considering in all of this, if the river is one that a lot of people recreate on, they may bed somewhere else in these areas. In open country, bedding can be super obvious. If you're out in one of the plain states, any amount of cover or structure can hold deer. A lot of times they just seem to materialize out of nowhere, but they were in a brushy draw or a ditch or tucked into some scrubby little trees where they can get shade and stay out of view. Cattail pockets are other places typically loaded with deer, and all of these things can generally be effectively sought out on the onX Hunt app. Now, hill country is an environment that I have yet to excel as a bow hunter. I've dabbled a little bit, but I've yet just to jump full into it. The fact of the matter is there's giant bucks in the hills, but between the physical challenge of actually getting to them and then the technical nature of understanding the wind and the thermals in a place where the wind's probably going to end up biting you in the butt, I just haven't built a high level of proficiency as a bow hunter. With that said though, in terms of identifying potential buck bedding in the hills, that is where e-scouting truly shines. The most typical buck bedding is on the leeward or downward side of the ridge, typically on a point of some sort. Usually they'll be about a third of the way down and they'll be able to smell everything coming over the top of the ridge, see everything below them. But where things get tricky is that they set up in a way that they're able to smell the rising thermals as well. This gives them an enormous advantage, which is how these hill country bucks get big and old. But just like all the other terrain types, I'll mark all the potential bedding areas on the map. Now we're ready to move on to the next step, and at this point we've qualified this property and figured out where these deer are spending a good amount of time feeding, hopefully, as well as where they're bedding. And now it comes down to figuring out where you can actually get within bow range of one of these bucks. When people talk about funnels, it's usually in discussion around the rut, but I'm trying to find any place that pinches down a buck's travel enough to slip an arrow on them, regardless of the time of season. If I am planning a rut hunt, I'm trying to find a funnel that connects large chunks of cover. The more ground that a specific pinch point connects, the better. In a swamp, an oak-covered peninsula may be all it takes to set up on a buck that's bedded just off the point. You probably need to hunt this with a just off wind, so he has the wind advantage, but you don't get winded. Maybe there's a thin strip of high ground that you can anticipate a buck taking to get out to a destination crop field. A funnel can also look like a giant tree that's fallen over, blocking several deer trails and forces the deer to walk around it, but that kind of thing takes boots on the ground scouting to figure out. In farmland, funnels can look like a brushy fence line or a skinny patch of woods or cover, or it can also be an inside corner of a field. An inside corner takes advantage of the fact that deer want to take the shortest route as possible while staying in the cover. If a buck wanted to get from one area to another around the field, he could just go straight through the field, but he isn't likely to expose himself, so instead he's going to wrap around the field corner and stay in the woods. Other great funnels are an open gate or a low spot in the fence, but again, those are the types of things that you can only figure out once you're actually there in person. River bottoms often create funnels themselves. Deer are naturally going to travel parallel to the river edge in a lot of cases. A big sweeping turn in the river will force deer to walk around the outside, similar to how an inside corner directs traffic in farm country. Once again, at least for the rut in all these cases, the larger chunks of cover that a pinch point connects, the better. Open country can be tricky due to the name itself. Sometimes there's less terrain or cover dictating where deer move. Other areas may have super obvious pinch points because deer may tend to hug any existing cover there is, even if it's the only brushy fence row for miles. Keep in mind though that it may not be practical to find a tree to hunt out of in the area that you need to be, and this is where it pays to be versatile and figure out a way to hunt from the ground. In hill country, there's a variety of ways that the terrain funnels deer movement. The most common funnel that you hear about is a saddle, and a saddle is just a low point between two higher points on a ridge, and deer, just like people, and typically take the path of least resistance. So this is the easiest way for them to get from one ridge to the next or from one side to the other. Steep bluffs and draws will force deer to go around them. Hubs where multiple ridges come together can also help predict deer travel. Benches or flatter areas on hillsides are great places to intercept deer travel as well. In all of these terrains, as you start marking off all of these funnels, you can really start to build a hunt plan, or at least have a really solid place to start your scouting. You should have a ballpark idea of where the deer are feeding, where they're bedding, and now have a place that you can potentially intercept them and set up on them. If you are e-scouting for a travel hunt, You'll have to scout your way into one of these spots and pick a tree on the fly, but otherwise, ideally you would scout these areas in the off season and get more specific with your scouting efforts. Remember, the goal with e-scouting is just to qualify and prioritize areas. To simplify things as much as possible, your goal is just to find deery areas that don't get pressured and then figure out how to get within bow range of the deer. There's levels to e-scouting, and the more you learn, the more effective and detail oriented you can be. If you guys have questions or want to share tips of your own, drop those down below in the comments, but make sure you're subscribed to my channel to follow along on all of my hunts this fall. If you guys really want to level up your scouting skills once you actually identify an area, check out these videos right here.